Now let us discuss the application of audit sampling in test of controls or TOC. So first, let us understand the sampling risk in a test of controls. So remember when we say sampling risk, so this is risk that the samples that we have selected are not representative of the population. And we can address this risk by properly designing our sampling plan. So first, we have risk of assessing control risk too high, also known as type 1 risk or alpha risk. So in this case, this is considered as a risk of under-reliance. So because the auditor assesses control risk too high, when in reality, it's not really that high. So therefore, it's like that the auditor is somehow, to use a layman's term, so paranoid about the condition of control. So believing the control risk is very high, but in reality, the controls are working effectively. So it will affect the audit efficiency because if the auditor believes no that the control risk is too high than it actually is, then the auditor uh, will perform more extensive tests. So the auditor will perform more extensive tests. So and therefore, more work will be done than necessary. Okay, or more work will have to be performed than necessary. Another is risk of assessing control risk too low. So in this case, the auditor is somehow relaxed. So thinking that the control is working effectively, but in reality, it is not. So that is why this is considered as risk of over-reliance. So the auditor is over-relying on the related control. So this is called type 2 risk or beta risk. Now, this one affects audit effectiveness. So because the auditor relies not too much in the control, when in reality, the control is not working effectively. So it could affect the auditor's conclusion. So because if the auditor incorrectly relied on the internal control, it could lead to incorrect conclusion and the end. Okay? So that is why it affects audit effectiveness. And between alpha risk and beta risk, or assessing control risk too high and assessing control risk too low, more dangerous is the assessing control risk too low. So because in the first type of risk, so what will be affected is not our conclusion, but only the work performed. So in this case, you perform more work than necessary, but yet you arrive at the same conclusion. But in the second scenario, what happens here is that you rely too much on the control, relying it to be able to reduce the material misstatement, but in reality, there will be a lot of material misstatement because the control risk is actually high, so than you thought. So therefore, it could lead to an inappropriate reliance and therefore inappropriate conclusion. So that is why when we design our sampling plan, we consider this risk, assessing risk, control risk too low. Now in TOC, what we perform is what we call an attribute sampling. So attribute sampling is used in test of control. So we reach a conclusion in terms of occurrence rate or exception rate. So the peso amounts here are irrelevant. So my examples earlier, like for example, sales order should be approved by the credit department before further processing. So the attribute or the characteristic is that the credit officer should sign on the sales order before further processing it. Okay, so another example of control would be, let's say, in purchases. So the purchases should be made to valid vendors. So therefore, if the vendor in the purchase order is not among the valid list of vendors of client, so that is an exception from the control. So that is why if, for example, out of 10 sales order, so one does not have the appropriate approval, so the exception rate is 1/10. Or in the purchases, so let's say 2 out of 10 purchases came from vendors who are not accredited by the client, then that is 2 out of 10 exception rate. So here are the steps that we perform in designing our sampling plan in TOC. Okay? So number one, we determine the objective of the test. So the objective of the test in test of control is to obtain reasonable assurance about the design and operating effectiveness of internal control. So let's say, for example, we're doing TOC on sales. Then our objective is to obtain reasonable assurance that, let's say, the sales transaction have properly designed control and such control is operating effectively. So we use attribute sampling only when there is an audit trail. Now, like, for example, an invoice, a sales order, or a purchase order, shipping document. Those are examples of audit trail. And then we define the attributes and the deviation condition. So attributes are characteristics indicating the operations of internal control procedure. For example, signature or sign off of credit officer. So that is an example of attribute of control over the sales process. So the deviation is when there is a departure from the prescribed internal control policy or procedure. So like, for example, the deviation is if the sales order processed by the shipping department lacks the signature or sign off of credit department or the credit officer. So that is a deviation. So as auditor, we have to consider the tolerable rate of deviation. Tolerable rate of deviation is similar to the concept of materiality. Okay? So based on our preliminary assessment of control risk. So let's say, based on our experience, based on our judgment, so we think, let's say, 5% is tolerable, meaning 5 sales order out of 100 sales order process without signature of credit department is 5. So it means the controls are still operating effectively because 95% of the time, the sales order has been signed off by the credit department or the credit officer. Okay? So then we define the population. So the population in test of control would be the class of transaction. For example, sales transaction process by the shipping department. So our conclusion in test of control can only be drawn to the population from which the samples were selected. Okay, so for example, we only test sales transaction for January 2021. Then our conclusion about the effectiveness of internal control can only be extended to January 2021. We cannot use the same conclusion to judge the control on February 2021 if our population only pertain to January 2021. Okay? And then before we proceed with our test, we have to define the period covered by the test. Let's say, the January 2021 or January to December 31, 2021. So we design the sampling unit. For example, in my example earlier, sales order. So the sales order should be approved, stamp approved by the credit officer or credit department. And we have to consider the completeness of the transaction. If the documents are pre-numbered like sales order, then before selecting sample for testing, we have to consider that the sales order are complete. Okay? So if, for example, the sales order used in January is sales order 1,000 to 1,500, so then we have to consider whether there are missing documents in between those two beginning and ending sales order number. Okay? So if for example, there is a list of sales order in electronic format, so we can use a spreadsheet application or audit software in validating the completeness of the sequence of the documents involved in our testing. Okay? And then we determine the method of selecting samples. So here are the examples that we mentioned earlier. So we have random number sampling, so systematic sampling, haphazard sampling. So we discourage the use of block sampling in certain instances. So there's only a specific application of block sampling. So in that case, these are the usual method of sample selection in test of control. Okay. So in this case, once we have identified the sample size, we will use the appropriate sample selection method based on our discussion earlier. So let's say the documents have consecutive number, then we can use the random number sampling. Okay, if it has no consecutive number, then we have to use systematic sampling. So because random sampling will not be feasible. Okay, but we have to concern the potential bias. So we can use a random start, for example, when we use systematic sampling to avoid the bias. Okay. So haphazard sampling, we can only use this if we are using a non-statistical sampling approach. So for statistical sampling approach, we can only use probabilistic sample selection method like random number sampling and systematic sampling. Okay? And then in determining the sample size, for example, the population is 100,000 or 1,000. So in practice, we are following the laws of probability or science. So that is why we already have a predetermined uh, sample size table which will serve as a basis for us to select the number of our sample. Okay, so this is an example of uh, statistical sample size table, okay, that we use in practice. Now, in many auditing firms, in big auditing firms, usually we use a software. So a software, we just input there the parameters, no? The parameters like, for example, the level of assessing control risk too low. So because that is the beta risk, that is what we consider our expected population deviation rate and our tolerable deviation rate. Okay? So the expected population deviation rate, so this is based on the auditor's judgment. So the rate of deviation that we expect from the documents of our client, okay, from the application of the controls of our client, which may be based by from our understanding of the controls of our client and also their past, no, our past experience with the particular client. Okay, so like for example, we expect that there is only 1% of expected deviation rate on the control of the client. So let's say out of 100 documents in the past, only one document will lack the necessary control. Okay, or we're in one document wherein the related control will not be applied. So the expected population deviation rate would be 1%. That's an example of parameter. And based on our discussion earlier, let's say our tolerable, our materiality, acceptable tolerable depreciation rate is 5. So we expect that the client will commit one deviation, okay? But the maximum deviation that they can commit before we consider the control as not effective is up to 5% based on our judgment, based on our experience from similar companies. So in that case, you will just match 5 and 1, then that will be your number of sample, no, 93 samples. So you will test 93 units. Okay, so assessing your control risk too low, your assessing control risk too low at 5%. So meaning to say, your sampling risk is 5%. So your confidence rate is 95%. So you will have a confidence of 95% that your samples are representative of the population. So you can set a different risk of assessing control is too low, such as 10%. In that case, what will happen is that your confidence level will decline, no, to 90%. You will just be 90% confident that your sample is representative of your population. So again, the acceptable level of control risk will depend on the judgment of the auditor, the risk involved in auditing that particular client. For example, if the client is risky, you might want to increase your confidence level to 95%. So therefore, you will be using 5% of assessing control risk too low in determining the parameter of your sample size. Okay? So, and finally, so this sample size table will usually assume a very large population. Okay? So because if the population is too small, like for example, there's only 100 items to be tested, then there's no sense using sampling. So you'll have to test 100% instead of sampling if the population is very small. Okay? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the way of identifying the specific sample size is based on a complex calculation. Now, there's a math or science behind that. That is why we are referring to the sampling size table earlier. So that is something based on research and computation that has been already made based on a previous study. Okay, so what we need to understand as students of auditing is how the parameters could affect the level of sample size that we will select on our procedures. Okay, like for example, in this case, if there is an increase in reliance on accounting system and internal control system, the impact on the extent of our test will increase. So the more that we wanted to rely on the control, then the higher would be the amount of items that we need to test. Now, increase in tolerable deviation rate. Again, remember this tolerable deviation rate works similar to materiality. So, a higher tolerable deviation rate would decrease the amount of sample that we will test from a population. Okay? Like for example, in our illustration earlier, if the tolerable exception rate or deviation rate of the auditor is 5%, is increased to 10%. So meaning, even if the controls will not work for 10% of the time, then it's still acceptable. It will result to fewer tests or fewer items to be tested. Okay? But if you decrease the tolerable deviation rate, for example, you lower it from 5% to 3%, then meaning to say you want the control to be more strict. Okay? Only 3% acceptable or tolerable deviation rate, then you'll have to increase your test to validate the control to be relied on by the auditor. So it will result to decrease of sample size. So the expected deviation rate is similar to risk. Okay, the higher the risk, then more sample size. The lower the risk, then lower sample size. So increase in the auditor's required confidence level. Earlier, we used 95% confidence level or 5% risk of assessing control risk too low. So if you increase the confidence level, for example, you increase it to 98%. So therefore, it will decrease the risk of assessing control risk too low, which is 2%. If the confidence level is 98%, so they are complement of each other. So if the confidence level is 95, the risk is 5%. If the confidence level is 98, the risk is 2%. It will increase the sample size. Okay? But if you decrease the confidence level, for example, 90% is your confidence level. So meaning that there is also a decrease in reliance. So therefore, it will decrease the sample size. So finally, the number of sampling units in population, assuming a large population. Again, assuming a large population, so it will not have any effect on the sample size. As you saw earlier in our table, there's a fixed sample size at a specific tolerable deviation rate and expected deviation rate given a risk of assessing control risk too low na 5%. Okay, so whether, for example, the population is 1 million, it was increased to 1,500,000. The sample size for expected deviation rate of 1% and tolerable deviation rate of 5% will still be 93 units. So based on the sampling table that we have seen earlier. So that's how determination of sample size work based on these different parameters. So usually this is the one that is being asked in examination, particularly in the CPA board examination. Okay. However, in practice, the determination of sample size is somehow a mechanical process. Once you have planned your parameter, you have to input it in the audit software and it will generate the number of sample size for you to be used, or for you to use rather. Next, you perform the sampling plan. So now that you know the number of items that you need to test, for example, 93 units or 93 documents, you have chosen your sample selection method, let's say random number sampling or systematic sampling. So you'll have to execute the sampling plan. Okay? So let's say the population is 100,000 units and you need to test 93 units. If you will use random selection number, you will generate a random a 93 random document number. So based on the population. So if the population's document is 1 to 100,000, invoice number 1 to invoice number 100,000, then the system will select 93 random document number from 1 to 100,000. And once it has chosen, then you select those document number from the population and check for the attributes, whether the credit officer signed off on the sales order processed further by the shipping department. Okay? So on this part, we'll discuss the other sampling approach in TOC. So that's the usual way, no? The one that I just discussed. That is the usual way of going with the test of control. So other sampling approach in TOC, we also have what we call sequential sampling or stop or go. So in this sampling approach, we apply this if we expect very few errors. Okay, that is why after testing a sample, we decide whether to stop testing or to continue with our sampling plan. So let's say we have selected 93 units. The first unit is compliant with the control. So there is signature of credit department. Then we proceed to the next sample. Okay? So under normal circumstances, we'll have to finish the entire 93. Okay? We'll finish the entire 93. If out of that 93, let's say two documents did not comply with the control, that will be our exception rate, 2 over 93. Okay? But under stop or go, once we have identified the certain number of exception, let's say we have reached 5 exceptions, then we stop with our sampling plan already. We can conclude that the control is not operating effectively in this process. Okay? So in this case, another is discovery sampling. Discovery sampling is there is no expected deviation. So similar to sequential sampling, the difference is that here we have a very small materiality. So once we have found one exception only, we already conclude that the control is not operating effectively. So usually we apply this in critical controls, no? Like for example in fraud. So once we have discovered a fraud, even one instance only, then we can conclude that the control is not operating effectively related to that process. And then we evaluate the results and document our sampling procedure. So we evaluate whether the sample results support reliance on the control procedures that we have tested. So we evaluate the significance of the control deviation C by determining the upper deviation limit. Okay? So the upper deviation limit, we compare it with the tolerable rate of deviation. So in tolerable rate of deviation, this is our materiality. So in our example, for example, let's say 5%. So 5%, compare it with the upper deviation limit. The upper deviation limit is based on the result of your procedure. No, let's say out of going back to our example earlier, to make it easier to understand, let's say out of 100, two items were not compliant with internal control. So the rate of deviation is 2% or 2 over 100. However, the 2% is not the amount that you will have to compare with your tolerable deviation rate. So because the tolerable deviation rate, let's say, is 5%, so meaning a maximum of 5% deviation means the control is not operating effectively. And based on your sampling procedure, you only found 2 out of 100, then sir, it's already below 5%, meaning the control is operating effectively. However, remember that you tested 100 random units out of, let's say, 100,000. So had you selected a different set of 100 sample, okay, your actual deviation rate could be different from 2%. Now, it could be 3%, it could be 1%. So that is why you have to determine the upper deviation limit. Because in statistics, whenever you survey a certain item from a population, there is a margin of error, no, plus or minus your actual result. So if your result is 2%, okay, so it should be taken as or interpreted as 2% plus or minus the margin of error. So if you add the margin of error, that will be your upper deviation limit. That is the amount that you will have to compare with your tolerable deviation rate. So that is why the upper deviation limit or upper exception limit so represents the sample deviation rate plus the allowance for sampling risk. So this is the margin of error that I was talking about. Okay? So your sample deviation rate, this is the actual deviation that you have found based on your test. So let's say 2 out of 100 units have problem with compliance with internal control. Your actual or sample deviation rate is 2%. But you have to add the allowance for sampling risk. So this is your margin of error. And we also have a pre-made computation on how to determine the allowance for sampling risk. Okay, so the upper deviation limit is found by referring to a sampling table, taking into consideration our parameters again. No? The allowable risk of assessing control is too low and the number of deviation. Okay, and if this upper limit breach your tolerable rate of deviation, then the internal control system is not effective. Now, this is the example of sampling table in determining the upper deviation limit. Okay? So, this is a statistical sampling results evaluation table for TOC or test of control. So, this assumes 5% of assessing control risk too low, the beta risk, because again, that is the more significant risk. So, again, this table assumes a large population. So this is our sample size. So let's say our sample size is 100. We have to compare it with the actual number of deviations found. Okay? So to determine the upper limit. So let's illustrate, no, for it to be easier to understand. So let's say the auditor tested a sample of 150 items and found 8 deviations. So meaning you tested 150 documents. 150 items is your sample size. And out of those 150 documents, so 8 documents were not compliant, no, with the internal control. So 8 documents were found to be, for example, without the signature of the appropriate personnel. Okay? So now, if our parameter is that our allowable risk of assessing control risk too low is 5%. So again, this is based on judgment, meaning we want 95% confidence level. We will refer to the sampling table. What is the upper deviation limit for a 5% allowable risk of assessing control is too low and 8 deviation. So our deviation rate or sample deviation rate is 8 over 150. So 8 over 150 is 5.3%. So this is the actual deviation rate. Okay? So in this case, our upper limit, so we have 8 samples. Number of deviation found is 8 and sample size is 150. So the intersection of 8 and 150 is 9.5. So 9.5 is our upper limit. But remember, our actual deviation rate is only 5.3%, no? 8 over 150. However, in comparing with the tolerable error, we do not use 5.3%. We will use the upper limit, 9.5. Okay? So again, the deviation rate earlier is 5.3%. The upper limit is 9.5. So we will compare it with our tolerable deviation rate. So let's say our tolerable deviation rate is 6%. If our tolerable deviation rate is 6%, we will conclude that the control is not effective even if the actual deviation rate is only 5.3. Okay? So because 5.3 is below 6%, however, the upper limit is 9.5, which will breach 6% already, tolerable deviation rate. That is an assumed figure. So assuming our tolerable deviation rate is 6%, that is our materiality. Okay? So if our tolerable deviation rate is 15%, then probably the control is still operating effectively. So because the upper limit of 9.5 is still below 15%. Okay, but 15% is very high already. Okay? So in this case, the upper limit of 9.5% will be the one that we will compare with our materiality or tolerable deviation rate. And the difference between 9.5, the upper limit, and the actual deviation rate of 5.3, which is 4.2. So this is what we consider as the allowance for sampling risk. This is the margin of error. Okay, so meaning, had we tested a different 150 units, okay, the result could be as high as 9.5%. Okay, so because if it's tested a different 150, no, the deviation would not be 8. No, it could be more than 8, it could be less than 8. So the percentage could be different. It could be 7.1%, 8.2%, 6.3%. The highest amount possible would be 9.5% based on the formula. Okay? So in that case, this will be our upper limit, and the difference will be the allowance for sampling risk. Okay? So sometimes in the problem, what will be given will be the deviation rate, 5.3, and the allowance for sampling risk, 4.2. So to get the upper limit, you have to add the allowance for sampling risk. So 5.3 plus 4.2 equals the upper limit of 9.5. So again, 9.5 is the one that you will compare with the tolerable deviation rate that you have predetermined. Okay? So if your predetermined tolerable uh, deviation rate is 5%, then that means the control is not operating effectively. So because the 9.5% upper limit is higher than tolerable rate of 5%. Okay? Sir, what if our tolerable deviation rate is 10%? So let's say your tolerable deviation rate is 10%. The upper limit is lower than 10%, 9.5. Then your tendency is to conclude that the controls are still operating effectively. So because 9.5 is below 10%. However, you have to consider qualitative factors. So since the upper limit, 9.5, is so close to your tolerable deviation rate, 10%, you have to think twice whether you can still rely on the control or not. And that, guys, will be matter of professional judgment or preference already. Okay, so if you still choose to rely on the control despite it's very close, then that's up to you. However, if you feel that it's too close to the tolerable deviation rate, you can choose not to rely on the control, meaning judge it as not effective, even if the upper limit is below your tolerable deviation rate of 10%. Okay? So that's how we decide now whether the internal control system of our client is effective or not using this sampling approach. So of course, if the result of our test is that the controls are effective, reliable, then the impact will be reduced substantive test. So as we have discussed in our previous modules.